And thank you folks for spending the latter half of one of the last days of the conference with us folks. And not ducking out to the quarter. Lord knows you'll be lucky if I stick around enough time for the questions. So, Remember Me Fondly has two roots as a project. It starts off with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Valery Kostelev, who had one of the most fantastic life stories I've ever gotten to listen to. And it also started with an academic argument. But before we roll into that, just a quick survey, because I always like to check when I go to these events. Would anyone here identify as an oral historian? All right, fantastic. Oh, well, no.
Yeah.
Now you know how I feel.
Okay.
Yeah.
There should be more of us.
I know, right? Let's start a revolution. So, now, bonus question, additional question. Who here works with oral history within their spaces, even if they don't identify as a museum professional or oral historian? Okay, excellent. Now, here's the tricky one that gets me glared at. Who here thinks memory is an artifact? Oh my God, there's people who actually raise their hands. That never happens. So, as said, this project started with two people. Dr. Valery Kostelev, who in 2011 I had the incredible privilege to sit down and speak with and record his life stories for one of my introductions to oral history. It was a small course at York College of Pennsylvania down south. Oh, actually, that will be up north from here. So, Dr. Kostelev had lived a very rough life. He was born in the last year of World War II. He was a Soviet citizen, and he worked for the TASS news agency for most of his life. And in the 1980s, he was stationed in Morocco alongside two very dangerous and very psychotic KGB agents who were living with him, his wife, and his daughter. The man then spent 2 years working with the local CIA branch to dismember the Morocco KGB cell, and then spent another year traveling through Europe, escaping from his pursuers, eventually making his way to the eastern United States, ending up somehow in a little town in the Mason-Dixon of Pennsylvania. When we sat down, we talked about everything from his perspectives on Soviet history to his memories of Yuri Gagarin to just his harrowing escape and how in the end he ended up losing his wife and his daughter anyways. We put it in a transcript, and then it was gone. It was archived away, it was preserved, but you wouldn't find it unless you somehow were in the same room with me and this 90-year-old Russian gentleman, which would be weird because I should have noticed you. So, after completing my undergraduate, I go to Seton Hall. I'm attending the museum studies program there, and I go in thinking, well, what ways can oral history be applied? And the reason I asked you those three questions in the beginning is because every time I would mention oral history to museum professionals at Seton Hall, and many early conferences, about 5 years ago, I'd get this look like, Barr? Because the idea that, well, it's audio. It should just be in an archives or a library. Why are you talking about museum spaces? And I'd always think in my head, why are you talking about breaking curatorial voice and then acting surprised at human memory being included in that conversation? So, like any academic, I had to bulk up my argument. So I spent a year researching into how museum professionals have been applying oral history in new ways within their institutions, going beyond just simply collection and preservation and actually finding ways to use these memories, use these recordings, use these videos to reinterpret their space and just reinterpret their institutions. Which is why I was happy to be paired with Russ today, because, oh my God, it's actually happening. Mm-hmm. So, in the course of my research, I conducted, oral history interviews with these museum professionals, and I identified 3 paradigms of oral history. Now, in this, Now, in this instance, we're defining oral history in a little bit more of a general sense, because Lord knows, attend an oral history conference and you will have a fantastic conversation trying to identify that definition. So I identified oral history in my research as being the process of a formal, structured interview with a person regarding their life story, their history, or their perspective on historic events they were a participant in. And this can be as highly structured as something out of Columbia University towards something that's structured through family interviews with StoryCorps. What I do not include in these paradigms is publications, which I did that because what I'm working with here is specifically how are we using these oral histories within our spaces to interact with our visitors and get them to interact with our collections in relation to physical artifacts. So behind me, we've got the three paradigms here, which eventually, once I found something that worked with alliteration, I found good names for them. So I sort of view this as less of separate ways of thinking and more or less an evolution of a process. So what we typically start with in museum professionalism is archival, which is defined here. It's the application of oral history as part of a collection, part of storage, part of preservation. And the second that we move on to is typically augmentative, which is where the use of oral history through either video or audio projection is moved closer into interaction with our collections and within our interpretations with visitors. The third one is one I still have to argue about and fight for. It is autonomous, where oral history is no longer, or oral history interviews are no longer tied strictly to the collections, but interviews, memories, form exhibitions and collections and structure that. Now it's sort of a diagonal line if you want to think about how this evolves. So I could have stacked it like that, but this works. But right now, most institutions are at augmentative with the digital revolution of the 2000s, where we're suddenly able to preserve so many more collections from old magnetic tape that had just been collecting dust in the back of historical societies. So we're stopped right about here. And the upper edge of autonomous, which is why I loved your presentation, is where we're slowly moving towards. But it takes guys like me to convince people that this is even something to be considered. So, as noted, archival tends to be what we're most familiar with. In the 1970s and 1980s, with the revolution of magnetic tape recorders and just the idea of public history coming into museum professionalism, you had this huge boom of historical societies that started collecting local memories and local histories. And then by the 1990s, they realized they didn't have a way to utilize this. So it was simply preserved. And up until about the 2000s, that was the way of the world. You simply had these either preserved in the library, and even when you had digitization, you had it in a minimal collection way. Yeah, you could post your collection online, but it was still just part of your archives and part of your collections. Now, what we're looking at here is part of one of my favorite institutions. This is the, what did they call him? Alpha Delta Concorde, which is part of the collection of the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York City. It is a preserved aircraft carrier that covers everything from World War II to Vietnam and the early Gulf War, as well as the use of the ship during the attacks on September 11th as a base for the CIA. Now, I got brought onto the institution in the summer of 2014, working within a combination of their collections and archival department, formalizing out their collections. And while I was there, I was a little bit, had a fly on the wall, and I was learning about all these fascinating ways that they took what was in their archives and they started applying it to interpretation. Fun fact, who here works at an older institution that has volunteers that have been there since it went under another name as a nonprofit? Well, I get to work at one of those places. So what they were doing at Intrepid was allowing docents, new, old, to actually take the oral history interviews and not just have them as a feature within their tour, but actually use them as a system of training for their guided tours of different spaces on the ship. So they would actually sit down with Leslie Scott, who completed one of the fastest transatlantic flights in the 1990s on the Concorde, and they would actually use that as part of their training and integrate it in how they would interpret that story of that space, rather than just going by the official record. Now, the reason this was so fascinating is because until they started doing that, almost everything they had on the experience of that transatlantic flight was completely wrong. Scott had to correct them about why they did it, which was really on a bet, pilots. How they worked with landing in London from JFK in New York, and how they operated with their air traffic control, and how they really sort of skirted a lot of laws of how the flight worked. Which before it was simply, this is how fast they went, this is how they landed, this is how the science of the flight worked. But because they were able to take that story and allow the docents to train on that, that gave them a new interpretation and a new way to engage their visitors. Now, oral history has a very strong presence in New York as a practice. It really started in the 1940s, 1950s with Columbia University's department. And just a few blocks up in Midtown, you had one of the strongest oral history initiatives in the 1990s with the MOMA's Artist Oral History Initiative, namely enough, which was a dedicated project towards collecting interviews with artists that had their pieces in the collection. And it wasn't just a matter of recording, well, what was your life history or what was your process. It was sitting these artists down in front of pieces that they hadn't seen in decades and having them explain what they were going through when they were creating this piece. What they were, what was their creative space, what was their emotional space, what was going on in their lives, and even incorporating preservation tips, and basically if they were working with organic medium, okay, this is how you want to keep this thing best preserved and how I envisioned it being cared for. So moving beyond just capturing a very formal structured interview, they captured an emotional space for these artists, and they have published it on their website, and they've continued to do fantastic work with that. And they've begun slowly the process of actually integrating that into tours. This was all done under Michel Alagat and Marjorie Theobalds. Now, I mentioned that volunteer a little bit earlier because this is a trend I've seen with smaller institutions that often, whenever I've brought up oral history, they've always asked, well, we're from the 1790s. We're a colonial log house that managed to survive out here. We don't really have a space for this kind of stuff. Well, one facet they always forget is institutional memory. The story of your site isn't just locked within, what was the history of the people that lived there. It's the history of the people that helped preserve that space and interpret that space. Fort Mifflin in Philadelphia has actually been making efforts to record interviews with members and volunteers that have been working on that site since the 1970s. And they've actually managed to reinterpret where the changes that have occurred on their site and repairs that had to have been done over time. A history that otherwise hadn't been recorded until they sat down with and collected that institutional memory. Now, things move into a little bit more of my favorable realm when we start talking about augmentative. Oh, speaking of quilts. So, augmentative is a little bit closer to what we're familiar with when we're talking about digitized oral history being used in museum spaces. This is everything from sound stations, which are a little bit more traditional, stationary spaces. People sit down, they listen, they put on headphones, to everything from apps to interactive elements associated with exhibit spaces. One of my favorites was actually at the Michener Art Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, where they had a quilting exhibit that was actually visiting from Scotland, or from the Quilts Museum and Gallery in the United Kingdom. And what they had set up in the space was very simple, very low tech. It was a recording app on a tablet that they had mounted where visitors would be able to sit down and record their perceptions on the exhibition and their experience in it, and just how it made them feel and how the different quilts just wowed them. And they managed to collect and archive and store that as part of both reviewing for visitor services and audience engagement, but also for just the memories of the exhibit. Now, this, as said, this is where we are typically right now. Everything from interactive apps, working with RFIDs, to just again, like having video installations. But this is a little bit more of where we're moving as audio technology advances. So, on the left, we have a scene from In Our Own Voices from the Brooklyn Historical Society. It was an exhibition that was launched in 2007, or in our own words, my apologies. It was a Vietnam veteran oral history project initially that was started under Sadie Sullivan, who has done fantastic work of oral history in New York. And it just started as interviews, but actually only a year apart from when they started launching this project, there was a TED Talk in which an inventor introduced a technology called hypersonic audio, which I always have fun explaining. It is essentially sound concentrated to the point of a laser. It's sent out through a projector, and once it makes contact with a physical surface, it envelops that person within that sound. So it's moving beyond simply having an audio hookup within a physical space and actually creating a simple, controlled, immersive experience. Now, what they did was they took portraits of Vietnam veterans from Brooklyn in front of their favorite places in Brooklyn. They set them up throughout the society, and there's a small trigger plate you can't see on the floor there. But when you stood on it, the sound would project from the speakers there. It would hit you, and you'd hear this story as if I was speaking right in front of you. Now, one of my favorite stories from this was there was a young man who was considering enlisting in the United States military who got to stand in front of one of these exhibitions, and he was just reflecting on how much it had changed his perception on how he was going to serve. It hadn't discouraged him or encouraged him. It simply made him think more about the depth of what he was going to do, all for that immersive experience. Now, just up the block, there was something a little bit more low-tech at the Brooklyn Museum. It was an exhibit referred to as Question Wall, or Question Bridge, where it was a project that had been launched this was in 2011, and it was simply an audio interview conversation with African-American men that would be asked by an interviewer a question that another African-American man had about African-American culture and how they perceived males and their place within their culture. That man would then answer that question, separate from the other man, and then he would ask a question of his own, which would then be passed along to someone else. So Question Bridge, starting as an audio project, eventually evolved into an exhibition. And all it took was setting up a few flat screens in an exhibition hall and angling them so that each question bounced between each asker, creating what was once separate interviews and separate stories and creating a bridge between them all. Now, I say autonomous here because really what the oral history at this point is supposed to be able to do is to take a life of its own and to be able to stand on its own. And this is no better represented than by my friend and colleague in Philadelphia, Erin Bernard, and the Public History Truck. So I love this. That's actually an old postal history truck. And what she and her early nonprofit did was they loaded up with audio equipment and they moved throughout neighborhoods in northern Philadelphia, Fair Hill, Kensington, Chinatown, and they would establish block parties and invite members of the neighborhood to come out, record stories, eat food. They even had artists on hand that would interpret their stories at the time of the recording. And they would take these stories and build entire exhibitions on them. Everything from the gentrification of the neighborhood to the influence of the local fire department. And from that, they were able to build all these exhibitions and bridge these communities together in a much tighter way. The picture on the right is actually from a recent project they had where they were offering free haircuts for stories, where you come in, You get a cut, and while you're sitting down, you talk about the neighborhood and memories from it. This was in Fairhill. Now, some of you might be familiar with some of these projects. Some of you might even be already pursuing them in some way. But I included a word in this title that, going back to TED Talks, I would like to highlight for just a moment. Imperative. So, we're in a period of human history where we have such a fantastic capability of collecting memory and collecting perceptions and collecting stories that we haven't had in any other period in human history. It's moved beyond culture, it's moved beyond economics. You can drive out to Dakota right now and you can record stories and memories with water protectors as well as security that are living in the moment of the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. This was actually in April of 2016, the first time I gave this presentation. This was the 500 mass arrest in Washington, D.C. surrounding the 2016 election. So memories like this, memories of these events, people who lived within them are so invariably fragile, given human condition and human memory. And the ability to preserve them and interpret them in their space is just an extension of what we are already trying to do with artifacts, what we are already trying to do with historic sites. And to miss out on this opportunity, to miss this chance, in my opinion, is negligent. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for listening. And I will now field any questions you folks have.
Start with questions for Thomas, and then we might see if we have questions that speak to both or either of our presenters.
Mm-hmm.
Questions for Thomas?
Mm-hmm. Succinct, I like it. Oh.
Are you doing anything in recent?
Well, that's interesting. We tried launching a project a few months ago, but because of timing and, well, no, it wasn't even funding because it was cheap, but timing was just a difficult thing. There's an event in Pennsylvania called Music Fest, which is one of the largest music festivals in Pennsylvania. And it happens in Bethlehem every year. And it completely takes over the town. And it's been going on for over 25 years. And this is the first time that we were supposed to be really working with Music Fest and promoting ourselves at it. And one of the things we talked about was launching an oral history project, recording interviews with fairgoers that have been going there for over 25 years. Because it's not an event with like a distinction of generations that visited it. You have people that would bring back mugs that they had in 1995, and they would get them refilled at the event. That's one of the fun things there. Although the mugs back then were this small, and now they're this huge. But what we wanted to do was sit down with these event goers and just take a picture of them with their mug, and then just ask them about that year, and then ask them how they first got into Music Fest. Because there's just been such a diversity of performers that have been there, and of course you have a diversity of audiences that have been there. So unfortunately, we just missed out on time. There were too many things going on, and hopefully we're going to launch it in 2017.
Your example of collecting oral histories from New York artists caught my attention because you used a couple of concepts in there. You were talking about maybe a traditional framework of people being asked questions and asked to recall facts. This happened, that happened, I was doing X. And you talked about helping these people reconstruct an emotional context as well as the historical fact-based context. Are there any other spaces or realms that, as you're participating in the interview, whether you're more or less trying to be directive about what you're trying to gather, are there other contexts to be promoting and prompting people so that they open up as broadly as possible and include as many of these spaces and contexts?
Well, I mean, the trick of oral history is you need to have a goal in mind. It's a balancing act. You need to have a goal in mind when talking with these folks, but you need to also make sure you have that open interpretation. It's you're opening a vein of a story and you're letting it flow. Your goal is to just sort of make sure it fits within certain lines without structuring it or leading questions or anything like that. So it can be everything from very structured, this is what I remember, these are the details of events, to that emotional response. The idea is to capture the person And that's what I find so important in integrating oral history in museums, because we capture artifacts, we capture urns, we capture militaria, and here we have an opportunity to capture a personality, everything from that emotional response to vernacular to facial tics and anything like that, and to be able to interpret that. So it's really forgetting a little bit, letting go a little bit of yourself, and just making sure you capture that person in relation to that event and in relation to themselves as best you can.
So I would love to see a workshop on this. I mean, maybe there's room for that here.
There's definitely room. We just need people to propose it.
Bring me back. I'm in Pennsylvania, and Pittsburgh's next year.
So Nancy, I think we had one over here, and then we might try. And by the way, we're very much open, I think, now to both panelists.
Okay.
So if you guys want to ask just of the room.
Okay.
I have two related questions. One, are there any best practices in terms of audio capture that you recommend or suggest? And two, what kind of legal framework do you need when you record your guests so that you can use the audio in public space or remix it and edit it and however you use it in perpetuity?
Well, you do need to be extremely forward with, this is in a modern context, like oral history has just been in a weird place legally before the 2000s because nobody expected it to be included in an exhibition. So, people were recording from memoirs, or they were recording expecting it just to be preserved. They weren't expecting it to be very public. So the legality of oral history's use has been in a very interesting place over the past 15 years. So you do need to have release forms. You do need to you do need to be forward about how you're going to use this material, or you need to at least be forward in what kind of rights the person giving the story has in relation to what your rights are over what you record. So it has to be very, very clear. And as far as audio technology, I'll be honest, I'm very low tech. I've worked with a solid handful of oral histories on my own, and honestly, I work to collect and I work to have that transcription. So I'll work with anything from a simple recorder to actually that's pretty much all I can afford sometimes. But then if we're talking exhibitions, there's a company called Hypersound that actually produces the hypersonic or directional audio projectors, and those go for, you can get a pair of those for about $1,500, about $750 for the individual speakers. But yeah, and just touching on that that technological aspect, my suggestion is always to both capture audio and capture video. Some oral historians are very particular. We just need the transcript or we just need the audio, but the video captures the full experience and what they say.
I think we've got time for one more. So Nancy, you want to take it?
Just quickly on best practices, MuseWeb Foundation has developed a kind of a storytelling handbook with best practices. MuseWeb Foundation, which I'm happy to share with anybody. We used it in Baltimore. We're now using it with the Smithsonian traveling exhibitions, and it's kind of runs the gamut from release forms to technology to how to tell a good story. And that's kind of the question I wanted to ask you. So what we've been doing in Baltimore, now we're kind of branching out around the country, is, I'm not sure oral history is the right word for it. It's basically community-sourced cultural stories. So we're, instead of holding the mic and interviewing people, we're handing them the mic and saying, with very minimal scaffolding, what do you want to tell us about the culture, the heritage, the history, the art of your community? So we create a geographic boundary, which might be a town or a city or even a neighborhood. And we're saying, we're not asking for fiction, we're asking for something of your experience of culture here. And then they do everything. They do the writing, the reporting, the editing, the publishing. It's their content. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is, what do you see as the relationship between that kind of a content and an oral history, which I quite agree with you, functions very much like a collection object. It's a thing that's accessioned, it's preserved, it's exhibited. Would you think of this other thing in the same way, or is it more interpretation?
I think it's a sliding scale. Like a lot of what you described is similar to what Erin is doing in Philadelphia. And hopefully I'll be able to bring her to this with me or in Pittsburgh next year. But a lot of what she is doing is exactly that, stories of a geographic area, of Fairhill, of the relationship between Kensington to Temple University. And it really is handing people the mic. And I find that I'm a little bit of an anarchist in this matter as well, but I find that to be as valid in oral history so long as so long as the interviewers are informed of, hey, this is what we're looking for, not what the questions are, but this is what we like to do, and this is how we like to structure our interviews, and working with them on it. So long as you're having that relationship to your interviewees who are collecting and giving those stories, I consider that very much valid as an oral history, as much as anything structured within, say, the Intrepid or at Columbia University.
Okay, guys, I think it's time for us to wrap up. I'd love if we could give these guys a round of applause, and then